Space with Patrick Moore.
Good evening. As many people know, our flagship observatory, the Royal Greenwich Observatory, had been closed down to save money. And therefore, this may be the time to say something about just some of its achievements over the last 300 years. It was founded way back in 1675 by express order of King Charles II, mainly as a navigational aid. A new star catalogue was needed for use by British seamen out of sight land. They wanted to find their longitude. So the RGO was set up. The first director was the Reverend John Flamsteed. The last was Professor Jasper Wall. I'm glad to say he's with us now. Welcome back, Jasper.
Thank you, Patrick.
Well, back to Flamsteed. He did a good job, didn't he?
He did a wonderful job. His problem was that you need the coordinates at sea. You need latitude and longitude. Now, latitude is easy. Latitude you simply measure by looking at the altitude of the pole star. No problem. The real difficulty is longitude.
Right.
At any time, of course, you can measure your local time because you can see the sun, you can see the moon and the stars, so you can measure your local time. But longitude can be considered as a distance in time around the world, a concept we're familiar with now with jet travel and jet lag and so forth. You can measure your local time, but how do you relate that to a fixed point of time? How do you know, for instance, the Greenwich time?
So Flamsteed's task was to find a method of determining longitude when you're out at sea, far away from land.
It's a matter of trying to find the Greenwich time, and the way that Flamsteed was tasked with doing it and the way that he thought it could be done was to measure a precise backdrop, to measure the positions of the stars properly, which hadn't been done, and then to measure the position of the moon against that backdrop so that the position of the moon could be used like the hands of a clock by seamen and by navigators to determine what the time actually was at Greenwich. If the moon was at a particular point in the firmament, then that was a marker of Greenwich time. But measuring that backdrop led to the first great controversy of the observatory because Flamsteed was meticulous, too slow to publish, too slow in the eyes of Newton and Halley to put his results down in a useful form. And Newton, who had this great intellectual achievement of theory of gravity, which he was bursting to test, wanted to get his hands on Flamsteed's data. So rogue copies of the data came into existence. Flamsteed burnt them. Great scientific bitterness, and they were published eventually, of course, on essentially Flamsteed's death.
Next came Edmund Halley, of Halley's comet fame. He made a long series of observations of the movements of the moon, and yet, ironically, the catalogues were never used in the way that was originally meant.
That's right, Patrick. Next great controversy, and this concerned the second way of being able to find a reference time. And that was a simple one. You could carry the time with you, but you could only do that if you had a clock which worked at sea, and pendulum clocks of the type that you had in the 17th and 18th century were totally useless for this purpose. So the Board of Admiralty, Board of Longitude was set up by the Admiralty with a £20,000 prize to the person who could produce a clock which worked at sea. And John Harrison, after 25 years of endeavour, won this prize with his famous Harrison 4. Very different from the initial Harrison 1, 2, and 3, which were 2-foot-high things with wheels and springs and so forth. But his Harrison 4 did win the prize eventually. It took 2 sea trials, which it passed with flying colours, but then the Board of Longitude made him jump through a final hoop, which was to tell him that it had to be copyable. And here is Harrison 4 and Kendall 1, which eventually won Harrison the prize by proving that not only could it keep time, but it could be copied, and the science of marine chronometers, as clocks at sea were called, then was developed. And in fact, the Royal Greenwich Observatory calibrated Her Majesty's marine chronometers right up into the 1960s.
But of course, by that time, the Colonist Astronomer Royal, Neville Maskelyne, had perfected the lunar distance method of longitude finding.
Yes, well, this was the controversy. did Maskelyne in perfecting the lunar method, putting together the lunar observations of Halley and the backdrop of Flamsteed, in perfecting this method, did he delay the award of the prize to Harrison? Did he do so unfairly? Well, there are two sides to that argument. It's not cut and dried. But one thing is clear, that Maskelyne made a fundamental advance in pulling together a thing called the Nautical Almanac, a catalogue of the positions of the sun, moon, and planets and bright stars, and that catalogue, which predicts the positions of these things for the current year, is still in use today on Her Majesty's ships, and the astronomical version is still used and is the Bible for observational astronomers.
Of course, it was during the last century, during the regime of the rather formidable Sir George Airy, the Astronomer Royal and Director of Greenwich, that Greenwich became the timekeeping centre of the world.
Airy was an amazing man, a most remarkable, formidable individual indeed. He was meticulous in the sense that he kept every written record, so that the Airy archives include bound volumes of his works in which his laundry lists are carefully inserted in chronological order. He was the government authority on everything, from laying of sewers to the shape of the firmament. And it was under Airy that great new instruments were built in the Royal Observatories, including the Airy Transit Circle, a model of the type of transit circle we use today, and indeed the original one still works. And he built the Northumberland telescope, which now is still in use at Cambridge today. Indeed, under his reign in 1884, by international agreement, the zero of longitude was placed through Greenwich. And placing that zero of longitude means that you can stand with 1 foot in the eastern hemisphere and 1 foot in the western hemisphere.
As I'm doing there. But in our own century, it became painfully clear that Greenwich was no longer a good site for a telescope, too bright and too dirty. Therefore, the observatory instruments were moved down to the clear skies of Westminster Castle in Sussex. And there the observatory equipped with the new 98-inch Isaac Newton telescope and its associated dome.
Next controversy, Patrick. The Isaac Newton telescope was built at Westminster at a time when astronomers knew that it wasn't the ideal site, but politically it was only possible to build it at that time within the UK. But the realization was rapid that you needed high, dry mountain sites for good, efficient, effective optical observatories. And the island of La Palma, in the most western of the Canary Islands, offered a clear and excellent alternative. And it was on the island of La Palma, at its summit, at the Roque de los Muchachos, that the Royal Greenwich Observatory built UK's premier optical observatory from a bare mountain site in the late 1970s to the premier optical observatory it is today.
But the RGO, Westminster, remained the administrative centre and the main headquarters. But then, in the 1980s, came a real blow. Against the advice of almost every astronomer in the country, the decision was made to shift the RGO away from Westminster, just leaving the telescopes, and put it into an office block at Cambridge. And this was done. But work at La Palma went on, and was equipped there with the new WHT, or William Herschel telescope.
That's right, Patrick. The William Herschel is a landmark telescope in the sense that it contains features which are mandatory for every modern telescope. For example, the altitude azimuth drive, which is a compact mounting for the telescope, much easier to engineer, much more compact in terms of the dome it requires. And indeed, the building itself, the offices and control room, shifted away from the dome so that no heat from them can rise into the dome and damage the images. And indeed, those images obtained with the William Herschel telescope are spectacularly good. In particular, it is an excellent telescope down into the ultraviolet, which is a feature my colleague Max Bettini and his collaborators have exploited in a search for the most distant galaxies in the universe. Now, what Max and company did was to realize that the red shift of the most distant galaxies carried their light out of the ultraviolet band into the visual and red bands, so that if you imaged an area of sky and found objects which were there in the red and were there in the green, but were not there in the ultraviolet, despite the good imaging properties of the telescopes, then you had candidates for very high redshift galaxies. And the Hubble Space Telescope has taken on this technique and perfected it, really. And you can see from this graphic just how it works. The light from the galaxy shifted by the red shift towards the red and out of the ultraviolet, so that if you observe it through the filters shown, you see the images of the galaxies in all filter bands except in the ultraviolet, and then you know you've got yourself a very high redshift galaxy. These galaxies were taken by Max Bettini and collaborators, and their distribution in space has been mapped, and this has produced a horrendous shock for us, because you see from this graphic a uniform background distribution. The yellow curve is what we expect. What we actually saw was the galaxies clumping in great walls in space, and this clumpiness is far higher than predicted by our normal theory of gravity, which collects things together gradually as the universe evolves to the present day. So some serious rethinking required.
Something is very wrong. Well, certainly the William Herschel has been an outstanding success, but the next RGO project, the twin Gemini telescope, even larger. One was up in Hawaii, one in Chile.
Yes, it was this success with the William Herschel which I think led the RGO to getting some £9 million worth of contracts to build fundamental parts of the twin 8-meter telescopes, one in Chile, one in Hawaii. And the design of the mount for the primary mirror, the William Herschel telescope, which we see here, has been taken by the RGO to use as the starting point to design the mount for the thin 8-meter mirrors of the Gemini project. And the trouble with the Gemini mirrors is yes, they're huge, but they're also very thin. So it's like trying to support vast window panes. And the design of that the RGO has perfected uses a large number of pneumatically driven bellows, which are all computer controlled, together with a great airbag underneath the primary mirror to spread the load, so that when you tip the mirror down, you maintain a perfect parabolic mirror surface despite the changed gravity resulting from tipping the telescope over.
Then, of course, new methods also, active optics, adaptive optics. We can now even see surface details on a star, Betelgeuse.
Every modern telescope is now designed with adaptive and active optics as a possibility. Now, what this is a method of correcting for what our atmosphere does to star images. We love our atmosphere. It's a very friendly thing because it gives us oxygen and it prevents the hard ultraviolet from the sun from getting to us. But we hate it because it messes up the star images by hot bubbles in it, blurring them. But there's a way we can detect what these hot bubbles are actually doing to the image by using a reference star near our field of observation to determine how the images have been distorted, and then using a rubber mirror somewhere in the system to put the opposite correction in, so that the images blurred by the atmosphere, as we see in this graphic, spread out by the atmosphere, are brought together and resharpened into something which gives very high signal to our spectrographs, and something which gives resolution and images in big ground-based telescopes which are comparable in quality to that obtained with the Hubble Space Telescope.
Also, there are other techniques for producing better images.
Well, that's right, and my colleague Richard Wilson and collaborators at the RGO have taken, for example, the radio astronomy technique of aperture synthesis, and they've chopped up the 4-meter aperture of the William Herschel telescope into sub-apertures and combined them in the radio astronomy way to synthesize an extremely sharp image. And by doing so, they've been able to see the face of a star for the very first time with a ground-based telescope. This is Betelgeuse. This is 3 images of Betelgeuse, so you can see that the great features on the surface of this star have actually changed with time.
We mustn't forget also, we're now in the middle of what I call the electronic revolution. Things like CCDs, charge coupled devices, and the RGO has played a major role here in developing those.
Yes, it's played a fundamental role in making them the standard detector in astronomy. The latest version of detector development at the RGO has consisted of building a very wide field camera for the prime focus of the Isaac Newton telescope. We haven't mentioned the Isaac Newton telescope much since it was transferred to La Palma, but this has given the old Isaac Newton telescope a brand new life, because the camera, which consists of 4 large CCD systems mounted in a mosaic, this camera has now been installed at the prime focus of the Isaac Newton telescope. It gives it an enormous field of view, as we can see with this very wide field image containing our nearby spiral friend M101. But the large field won't be used primarily for looking at nearby galaxies. We'll be looking for deep space objects with deep images and providing great catalogues of interesting objects, cannon fodder if you like, for the new generation of telescopes, the 8-meter telescopes.
But we are still below the atmosphere. Come now to Hipparchos, the astrometric satellite, and the RGO was deeply involved there.
Yes, the RGO was involved right from conceptual stages of Hipparchos through to the final data analysis and data release to the community. And the satellite has indeed produced one result which particularly amazes me, which really is fundamental to our understanding of stars and of cosmology. And this is a study of the Pleiades, our friends the Pleiades, carried out by Floor von Leeuwen and colleagues with Hipparchos, in which Floor has determined that the distances to the Pleiades indicate that instead of the old open cluster lying on the main sequence in this diagram of luminosity against temperature, the Pleiades lie below it because the distances measured for the Pleiades do not coincide with what had been assumed for them earlier. Net result is we don't understand stellar evolution, we don't understand the theory of the stars, but in addition to that, our scaling of the universe, which used to be done just by fitting clusters to this main sequence, has also had to be rescaled by some 10 or 15%, so cosmological implications as well.
Quite apart from the research, the RGO was invaluable as a meeting point.
Yes, Patrick, I shall miss that aspect more than anything, I think. 40 years of consecutive summer schools, 40 years of consecutive international conferences, and we have done as much as we possibly could, I think, with public outreach, with public understanding of science, and with a real attempt to bring young people in as the next generation of scientists.
And now it's all come to an end. Our great observatory has passed into history. But one thing I'm sure, whatever happens, the RGO will never be forgotten. Jasper, thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick.
Well, don't forget, if you want the latest astronomical news, then ring up our information line, 0891 800 330, or CFAX page 620. And when I come back next month, we are still carrying on with telling time by the stars, and Dr. Alan Chapman is going to join me to show you how to make a nocturnal. And of course, don't forget the Leonid meteors. Good night.